Yeah. All right. Well, we will go ahead and get started. Thank you, everybody, for coming. Today, we're talking about identities and how important they are to your organization. Rosie is going to dive a little bit deeper. If you did get a chance to listen to our podcast, you kind of got a head start on some of what we're going to talk about, but we're going to go a little bit more deeply into it. If you haven't listened to the podcast, we will send out an email after this to thank you, and we'll include the podcast link in it for you. We're very lucky to have a guest from Paramount this month on our podcast. And we're not going to tell you who it is because you're going to have to just wait and find out when you listen to it, as well as Rosie's superhero and slash irrational fear. So, Rosie, if you're ready, you can go ahead and start. Take it away.
Thank you, Katie, and thank you everyone for attending these. This is the third in this series that we're doing, the third webinar. And if you have attended the other two that I did, you would have seen that I love to start these with a quote. So this month's quote, I'm actually using Taylor Swift. It's gonna be a bit of a challenge, but I think I could tie this quote back to what we're talking about today. The quote is, "I got a blank space, baby, and I'll write your name." And if you think about it, if you are a cybersecurity professional, particularly in the identity space, this is kind of what you do, right? You look for people's names and what those people can do, and ultimately what accounts can do, to better have an idea of exactly what's going on in the environment, and ultimately to reduce risk. It's a bit of a stretch, but I think I was able to work it in there. So let's talk about identities, and that's really what we want to talk about today. And you really can't talk about identities without talking about accounts, right? Accounts are kind of the fundamental way that end users ultimately access resources in your organization. So what is an account, right? If we kind of, I mean, obviously we all know what accounts are. This is why if you're attending this webinar, I'm sure you know what an account is. But let's think about it in the way that we think about accounts versus the way that we think about identities, right? So an account, of course, is an entry point into an asset in the organization. An account is just a component of an identity, specifically a digital identity of an organization. It is not the individual, it is not the human that actually uses that account. The account is independent, at least the way that we think about it. Um, Account inventories are organized, or you have to organize your accounts into what we call categories and types. And we'll kind of go do a deeper dive into what that means. And of course, there are different account types, and you really want to look at those account types to determine how I should be managing those types. Um, and of course, when you look at those account types, one of the biggest reasons why you need to kind of categorize those accounts and understand this is a service account, this is an admin account, this is the regular user account, is to apply those controls and violations, right? To understand that I want my service accounts to behave a certain way or have a certain level of access, and if they don't, if that is different than what I desire, either because it's industry best practices to run your service accounts that way, or regular user accounts, or any other account type, or it's an internal policy, I want to see that violation so I can take action. Because if you think about it, fundamentally, all risk reduction is finding violations and closing them, right? Getting rid of them. So let's talk about those categories, right? Those account types. So the way that we think about it here at Sphere is there's two main types of accounts. There are those accounts that are permanently owned and those accounts that are temporarily owned. And we'll dig into the differences between the two in the next slide. But within that context, we then have different account types. Things like I said before, your service accounts, your admin accounts, your database accounts, your regular user accounts, or something very specific to your environment, like I have here, the Tier 0 application service account for finance applications. Now, again, obviously, that's not a standard type, but you see what I mean. Within your organization, you're going to have very specific account types that you define, and then you're going to have a set of rules that defines what is that Tier 0 application service account for finance. And the reason you do this is, again, because the controls you put on that Tier 0 account might be different than the controls you are looking at or trying to enforce against an admin account. So let's talk about these ownership categories, kind of the high level category. So a permanently owned, or what we consider a permanently owned account, is typically something like a user's regular user account or an admin account. For example, you might have Bob Smith, right? And Bob Smith's account is B Smith. Bob Smith's admin account might be BSmith underscore ADM. Or the account that Bob uses to log into a SaaS application, right, could be BSmith underscore app, right? Something like that. Something that is about that Bob fully owns. Now, what's interesting about what we call a permanently owned account is that that account lives with Bob. If Bob leaves the firm, then that account should be disabled. No one else should have access to that account. No one else should be able to log into that account. It should be Bob's. And if Bob leaves the firm, that account should be disabled. If Bob even changes roles within the organization, perhaps that application account no longer applies for his new role and should be disabled. But the accounts live and die by the user and that user's presence in the organization. If we think about temporarily owned accounts, we use the word temporary here, but what we really mean is that ownership can change. Think about, let's take that example of Bob. Now, Bob happens to be a developer, and Bob happens to own a service account for that application. Bob decides he doesn't want to be a developer anymore, loves the world of HR, decides he's going to move to the HR team. He gets a job in the HR team. He now still owns and has access to that service account for that application that he used to support when he was a developer. Well, he has to give up that ownership. It doesn't make sense for Bob to own that account anymore because his role has changed. So that service account for that application, the ownership of that service account is temporary. Bob could leave the firm. Bob could move to HR. Bob can move to a different part of the organization. If it no longer makes sense for him to be the owner of that account, the ownership is transferred, right? And this is why we call it a temporary ownership of an account versus a permanent ownership that kind of lives with Bob. Now, some examples of these temporarily owned accounts. Again, we talked about the service accounts for an application, but sometimes it's some really old legacy account for some legacy application where you can't rotate the credentials for whatever reason because it's hard coded into a DLL. Obviously, not a desirable situation, but it does happen, right? You could have a local account on an individual server. Again, not the greatest situation from a security perspective. Regardless, Bob, as the owner of that application, has to be able to log into that server with that service account, and he may have full control over that account. But when Bob leaves, that account has to be assigned to someone else. Whereas Bob's primary account, his permanently owned account, that account gets disabled. So we've talked about the accounts, right? But what is an identity? What exactly do we categorize as an identity? We said an account is not an identity. B Smith is not Bob Smith. B Smith is the account that Bob happens to use to log into his laptop, but it is not who Bob Smith is. Really, the identity is the human that owns all of these accounts. And it's not just the human, but really the human and the relationship between that human and all of the various accounts that he or she owns. Now, again, some of these could be, permanent owned accounts, like I said, Bob Smith's primary account. Some of these could be service accounts. They can also be machine identities, but not in the way that a service account or Bob's primary account is. It's more about the relationship that that machine identity has to the asset that that machine identity can access. Someone, a human, must own that relationship. So identities, when we talk about identities, it's not just about the human, it's about the human with all of the accounts that they have control over and all of the relationships that they have to manage between those accounts and the assets that those accounts can access. When it comes to things like machine identities or service accounts, those non-human accounts, we call them non-human accounts, but the reality is you still have to have a human who is able to make decisions about whether or not those accounts should or should not exist. Let's talk about some of the challenges with identity. Well, first of all, location. We talk about this, and we talked a lot about this in the previous webinar and podcast. Accounts can and do live everywhere. Obviously, you have your Active Directory accounts. You have your accounts that might be in LDAP, But what about local Windows accounts, local database accounts, application accounts, SaaS accounts, machine identities? There is a huge amount or huge inventory of accounts that can exist outside of that main directory. And for most organizations, that main directory is something like Active Directory or Okta. But independent of that main directory, where it's relatively easy to discover all of those accounts, because again, it's a central directory, you have to think about all the other places that these accounts can live. And remember, those accounts live there, and unless those accounts are disabled, they will have access to something, whether it's a local Windows account that can log in interactively on that server, or a database account that has access to that one table that might have some client data. These accounts live and have access or have some type of entitlement, and you have to understand where they are, what are they doing, who owns them, right? What is the identity tied to these individual accounts? That's how you have a complete picture of the environment. So again, a full inventory of collecting all of those accounts is a challenge, right? It, like I said, it's very easy to collect that data from Active Directory, but what about all of these, some legacy Unix-based system that's sitting in a DMZ and for the most part, not directly or easily accessible? First of all, how do you know that that exists? And second, how do you collect the data from that legacy system? How do you collect the data from things like databases, Sybase, Oracle, MongoDB, any number of databases that might exist in the environment, and understanding exactly what those accounts have access to? Having that full inventory, that full collection is critical and one of the biggest challenges that people face. Next is ownership, right? We talked about the human being at the center of the identities, right? But the way that you put that human at the center, the way you draw the lines between those accounts and that human, for the most part, is through ownership, understanding who owns what accounts, because those are the people that have to make decisions about whether or not you can do the kinds of things that you want to do that reduces risk, like remediations, like onboarding accounts into a vaulting solution, like removing the privilege access of those accounts, like deleting those accounts, or taking what is a local account and moving it to a domain account as a prime example of the kinds of things that come up all the time when it comes to doing cleanup and ultimately risk reduction. The problem is that if you try to tackle ownership manually, it's a losing battle. The thing I like to say is that, the minute you hit save on that database, spreadsheet, Word document that has a list of all your assets, Notepad has a list of all your assets and the owner of that asset, the moment you hit save, it's outdated, right? Because you're dealing with a dynamic, constantly changing environment. But it is a problem. It is a problem that you do need to solve. So the other problem when it comes to things like cloud platforms and machine identities, this adds one additional layer of complexity because natively it doesn't make sense to have a human that's tied to these machine identities. I mean, they're machine identities, right? But the reality is you have to have that human. You have to have that individual that is able to take responsibility of that asset and understand that relationship when it's machine to machine, right? API keys, certificates. You have to have someone who understands that relationship and can say whether or not that relationship should or should not exist. So it all comes down to ownership. We talk about ownership a lot. It is key to everything that we do. It's really the key that it's a thing that prevents you from reducing risk as fast as you would like, if you think about it, right? Because without ownership and missing ownership means that you can't have that operational risk be sent over to the team that ultimately should own that operational risk. We talk a lot about operational risk in the webinar from last month, as well as the blog post and the podcast, where we talk about the idea of someone has to take responsibility who actually is authorized and has the knowledge to take the responsibility. This is not about passing the buck. This is about actually finding someone who understands what you're trying to do and can basically say, yeah, I agree that what you want to do is something that should be done from a security perspective, but also it's not going to cause any issues for us. It's not going to cause an operational risk. And that understanding of ownership and finding those individuals and then confirming that those are in fact the owners. Because it's one thing to, run some scripts and an algorithm, even using AI to find good owners to start with. You really need that owner to say, yes, I do own this. I am taking responsibility, where you can confirm that relationship ultimately between the human and the account that essentially creates what we're talking about today, the identities. Again, it's always about writing names and blank spaces. Just a callback. So what is the future of identities? With all these challenges, all these things that you have to solve, um, understanding kind of ultimately how you get to the from the point of discovering all the accounts, all the entitlements, discovering all the users or the humans in the organization, and then doing that relationship between the two so that you have people that you can start reaching out to. These are all the challenges and things you have to use in order to kind of or do in order to kind of tackle this identities problem. But where is this going? Like, why are identities so important? What is the future of identity? So, of course, I could sit here and give you all the buzzwords that I have on the screen here. The digital transformation, the identity is the new perimeter. This everyone loves saying that these days. AI, of course, generative AI. Everyone keeps talking and saying all these buzzwords, but what does it actually mean if you are an identity professional? Well, what these things will do is basically give you a more comprehensive way of determining ownership. Ownership, as I said, is the biggest challenge. It's the challenge that most organizations face. It's the thing that delays projects the most. And I think a combination of all of these things, specifically the new perimeter. I know, again, it's a buzzword. It's the phrase that everyone's saying, but it's a mindset thing too, right? When you think about the identity as the perimeter, you start thinking about things differently. You start operating differently. You start making decisions differently. You spend budget differently, and that alone will help in terms of getting this problem solved. The other idea, or the other thing you'll get from all of this new kind of emerging technology, is that deeper understanding of entitlements. If we think about an account can do X or an account can do Y. I think in the past, that understanding of what an account is was very superficial, right? And for the most part, everyone thought about an account as an end user's login into their environment. Then people started thinking about, well, we need service accounts that are dedicated for applications. And then, things got more sophisticated where we have to make sure that we are applying certain controls and we have to have secondary accounts. Then vaulting came into the mix of ensuring that anything that has any kind of elevated privilege is vaulted. All of these data points are things that are difficult to collect, difficult to manage, but it is something that through the new capabilities that we have with some of these buzzwords on the screen, it will make things a lot easier. But it's not something that's going to come overnight. It's not something that you can, next week we will have an AI, chatbot that can solve all of our identity problems. It's going to take years to solve this problem. And the idea of looking, it always comes down to, well, why am I doing this? Why am I collecting all this data? Why am I doing all this relationship stuff and figuring out who the owner is? Well, ultimately is to reduce risk. And you reduce risk by tackling violations, right? So all of the technology that you'll use to discover these assets, create those relationships, ultimately it's about reducing risk. And you reduce risk by, number one, finding those violations, and number two, actually remediating them. So with all of these challenges, all of these issues, what you have to do to tackle this issue, the challenges for tackling this issue, the question is, well, how does Sphereboard do it? How does Sphere do it? Well, of course, we use Sphereboard. We've talked about Sphereboard in many other webinars and podcasts. And Sphereboard is our identity hygiene platform, which is made up of what we call engines. Each engine has a specific task. So let's dig into each engine and talk about how each engine solves the issues that we've talked about up until this point. So of course we have our discovery engine, and our discovery engine is exactly what we've been talking about: that discovery, that finding those groups nested deep in some directory, or privileged some privileged account in on a Unix box or a database that could be directly permissioned or nested any number of directories deep somewhere in AD or LDAP or any other directory that you use. That account discovery, our connectors go out and collect all this data from all these various target systems to give you that full inventory, right? And these connectors are 100% agentless, right? Which, you know, in this day and age is something that you absolutely need to do in order to be able to even be allowed to run these across a large estate. But ultimately, it gives you that full inventory of all the accounts and all the entitlements of the accounts. Through HR automation is now where, so we brought in the accounts, but now let's bring in the information about the people, right? So our HR automation tool allows us to bring in information about the people in the organization and exactly who they are, who they report to, and ultimately allows us to get to the account type rules engine, right? We've collected all of the accounts, all of the people. Now we're looking at that massive list of accounts, could be millions and millions of accounts, and looking at that large inventory, having an understanding of that large inventory of accounts becomes difficult, right? It's a big list. But what you can do is start categorizing it, right? Thinking about the idea that some of these accounts are permanently owned, some of these accounts are temporarily owned, but more importantly, a bucket of these accounts are service accounts, a bucket are admin accounts, a bucket are regular user accounts. Having that understanding will allow you to effectively apply controls to those different account types. So you can, instead of having a huge inventory of lots of stuff that most of it is going to be information, we can highlight the 3, the 4, the 10, even the 100 that are issues that need to be addressed versus having a large inventory of millions of accounts. And then, of course, our ownership engine. This is where we're taking that large inventory of accounts and saying, okay, well, who do I need to talk to if when it comes time for me to make changes? Who are the people that are going to take the operational risk for the kinds of changes that I need to make in order to resolve security issues? So our ownership engine uses a library of methods. We call them methods because there is no single method that works for everything. So you generally want to run more than one method and try to whittle down that list of accounts with missing owners to the point where you've found ownership across all of these accounts, or at least the vast majority. And then you could go that next step where you're now reaching out to those people and asking them, hey, are you still the owner of this? Yes or no? And if you're not, do you know who the owner is? Can you reassign it? So to summarize what Sphereboard does, our discovery engine is how we discover all of the accounts and all of the people, right? Understanding the humans in the organization and all of the accounts that those humans are using. The asset type engine is where we're taking that large inventory of accounts and kind of creating buckets, right? Manageable or much more manageable buckets than a long inventory list of potentially millions. And then finally, ownership is where we're establishing the relationship between that human that we found and 1, 10, 15, 30 accounts that human may own, because each one of those accounts has a potentially a different set of entitlements. So understanding not just what an individual account can do, but what that human can do through the relationship, through ownership of those accounts. That's like again, ownership is the key to all of this, right? And the glue that gets you to some of the things that we're going to be actually talking about in future podcasts, webinar, and blog posts. We're going to start going into, okay, so we've collected all of this, but what about those controls that I've been talking about? What about the violations? How do we do that? How do we figure that out? That's actually going to be the next webinar that we cover in this series, where we say, with all of this inventory data, how do we apply that layer of controls so that we could highlight the 3 bad things out of the 1,000 things that we've discovered? And then once you've done that, you actually are ready to start fixing things. So soon after we talk about the controls engine, we're going to start talking about campaigning and reaching out to those owners and doing things like ownership confirmation and getting responses to the owners. And then finally, what we call our virtual worker, our remediation engine, is what goes out and makes changes to those target systems, whether it's onboarding an account into a vaulting solution because that account is privileged, or removing the entitlements of the account, or cleaning up an AD group, cleaning up a file share. Our virtual workers is what closes the loop, right? From the moment you discovered the issue to the moment and all of the steps leading up to to that remediation ultimately gets you to that risk reduction. And that's really what the tool is meant to do. It's meant to take you from the moment that you find the source of the issue, confirming that that issue is in fact an issue, knowing who is the person responsible for resolving that issue, talking to that person virtually through the tool, of course, and then finally cleaning it up. And if you think about it, if you were doing all of this manually, this is exactly what a human could do. What the tool allows you to do is do it at scale. With that, are there any questions?
It's like we have a question in the chat. So Russell asked, is this a single tool or all of the different engines modules to purchase?
No, so it is a single tool. The three areas that we focus are accounts, data, and Active Directory. When you purchase the accounts module, Active Directory is included in that, but it is a single tool that will then discover all of your assets and give you that whole workflow in terms of reaching out to the users and ultimately doing remediation. And we don't sell the tool by connectors. You essentially, when you own the tool, you own every connector we have and every connector we will have covering that platform or covering that topic. And we're talking about accounts primarily today. So it is a single tool, not a bunch of components that you have to kind of glue together.
So as Rosie said, we are actually covering controls and violations next month. So our podcast will come out in the second week of the month. The episode's going to be called Control Alt Defeat. Basically, you found all these things, you've got this large inventory, you know what you need to fix, but how are you going to fix it? And what rules are you going to apply to it? So we will give you all of those details and more next month. After this, we will definitely follow up with you guys and get you the recording to this as well as the link to the podcast. And you can register at that same page for the next episode if you would like to join. We're so grateful that you all came, and we really look forward to seeing you next month. I hope you have a great month and talk to you soon. Bye, everybody.